Community Design Center is pleased to welcome Klaus Philipsen.
Thank you for that generous introduction, especially the part that I haven't written myself. I have to read this to my wife. Anyway, good evening and thanks for coming out. The intrepid Rochester folks that are coming even when the snow is piling up. You know, in Baltimore we would have called this event off at 10 o'clock this morning. So thanks to Maria, her whole team, the board. This is just a wonderful thing to have this series of lectures. I'm very impressed that you guys are doing this and find this really, really great and would like you to give a hand to the design team and to the Rochester Community Design Group and to yourselves for coming out tonight. And coming out to something like this is a commitment to your community. You care about Rochester, and that is really what is the beginning of a lot of the solutions. I will just briefly touch on, beyond the introduction, why I picked housing as the topic, although the city is really what I care about in general and has many other facets. And I started with being introduced to low-income housing as a student in 1972, 3, 4, something like that. And we did a project where, it was in the time of the first oil crisis and social awareness, the 68ers, is, as we called it in France and probably here as well, the SDS and all of that. And so we cared about social commitment. And so as one of the projects we did is assist local housing tenants to overcome their bad housing conditions through a plan assist that we did as students. And it was then published as my first little book that was basically a guide to resistance for housing tenants, public housing tenants. And then it went on from there. In Germany, I did some I did affordable housing in Germany as new construction in the suburbs and as well as in downtown Stuttgart, which was at the time really one of the first projects where we brought people back to the city. And Stuttgart is a city of 600-some thousand people. It is about the same size as Baltimore, and it is the Detroit of Germany. It just doesn't have quite the problems of Detroit, but it is the Detroit because it's German's Motown. There's Porsche and Mercedes comes from there. And so people there love their cars even more than, they don't have as many parking lots. We'll get back to that. Then I came to Baltimore in '92, and then I did learn about adaptive reuse. So one of the first projects I did was designing a can factory that was repurposed for high-income housing directly on the waterfront. But then we did also adaptive reuse for a school, and we did adaptive reuse then when I started my own firm on a number of projects, including a printing facility that had a firehouse connected to it. It was all rather complicated. We did also affordable housing as transit-oriented development in our Station North Arts and Entertainment District. So with that, I want to just talk briefly about the two cities that we have here tonight. And I'm trying to go in my presentation from housing and affordability issues to equity issues to the impacts on health, how one can avoid displacement, a whole lot of things. So we have to kind of rush a bit to get through all of this, but I think we will make it. But first, the two cities are, of course, similar and different in many ways. So Baltimore is bigger, and you can see that there, and the poverty rate is a little lower. But we do have, other than those differences, a lot in common. We both are shrinking cities, and both have a strong corporate history of corporations that left us, and we have a renaissance shaped around water. In both cities, Caucasians are a minority. Both have strong universities. Both have a strong historic building stock. But unfortunately, both cities also share a lot of pathologies, including strong ethnic segregation to this day. So the colors are a little faded out there, but blue represents the African American folks, and red the Caucasian folks, and Rochester and Baltimore have the same colors there. This is from the 2010 American Community Survey, and you can see that these areas are very segregated. Then we have, in a similar way, large discrepancies in health. And the discrepancies in Baltimore are such that somebody did this map where the neighborhoods get names of countries in the world, and so we have like Rwanda and North Korea and Switzerland all within a few miles of each other when you tag the corresponding life expectancy. And so between Switzerland and Rwanda, that would be 20 years of life expectancy difference in just within a couple of miles. And that is in Monroe County, 10 years, that difference. So these are these two life expectancy difference maps. And that means that your health is more determined by the zip code than by your gene code. And that's not good. But these differences are not unique to Rochester and Baltimore. They are common across the world, really, but especially across the United States. So we will discuss in what way housing is a key indicator for these health discrepancies. So poor health, race division, and high concentrations of poverty happen so that geospatially they are almost congruent. So that is to say that whatever pathology you look up, whether they are happening in the same spaces, and the maps always look almost identical. And there are a number of reasons for them, for this type of geography that many of our cities have. And one has to do with urban renewal and the fixation on the automobile. So Baltimore and Rochester have a highway to nowhere, but you are ahead of us because you filled yours already partially in, and we are still just dreaming about that. And both cities, and more influential than the automobile was the housing policy that was set forth either on the local level through zoning, and Baltimore has a very bad history with having invented basically race restrictive zoning, or nationally through the infamous redlining by the Federal Housing Administration and the Federal Loan Bank. That goes back to the 1930s and 40s, and I pulled out Rochester's redlining map and the Baltimore redlining map. And you will see that these maps look very similar to the pathologies that I just described a little while ago. So after redlining came blockbusting restrictive covenants and a half century of subsidizing suburban development through, for example, the mortgage deductions. So essentially, one could say that the way how the federal policy has worked, that the homeowners in the suburbs live in subsidized housing, but that's not usually how we describe that. So housing shapes cities, no question. One can say the American city is defined by its housing and its housing policies, and therefore nothing will tell us more about the future of our cities than our solutions to housing, what we preserve, what we demolish, and what we will build, and for what we will find money, and for what we won't find money or won't want to spend it. The recent post on industrial urban renaissance, the recent past with urban renaissance through people who are attracted to mixed-use, walkable place and in reasonable transit. That is progress. But so far, that progress has been very insular, and it has not really resolved the separations and the segregation that I described earlier. So on occasion of the 50th anniversary last year of Martin Luther King's assassination, we talked a lot about the Kerner Commission's findings of 1968, two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal, and we had to find that we haven't made all that much progress in the last 50 years. And this is a condition which is utterly unsustainable morally, socially, fiscally, and economically. And because our local fiscal system is highly depending on property taxes, housing plays a central role in how we solve the problem. So I use this British report titled Home Economics for its cute title, and it gives us a number of very simple metrics on how to measure whether housing is successful or not. So in this Home Economics report, it says that housing is essential to the economic health of cities and regions, and there need to be a few metrics fulfilled in order to be successful economically for the region. There needs to be enough housing. There needs to be enough housing at affordable prices, of the right type, in the right place, and at an acceptable standard. And affordable, right type, right place, and acceptable standard expand on the definition of design, and to include economics, equity, social justice, sustainability, and resilience. So we architects have to learn to expand our definition here, those of us who are architects. So first, the question of not enough. So this is a graph that shows the national housing production, and you can see that in 1972 we had about over 2.5 million housing units, and in 2016 we had just about 1.2 or 3, so half of that. So the national production of all kinds of housing together has gone down. So there is not enough. Additionally, too much housing doesn't match the demographics and the needs. Too much housing is in the wrong place, and too much is below acceptable standards. And that is shown here. So you see on the left the estimated demand, and on the right the estimated supply that was in 2013. So that may be not totally accurate anymore, but you can see that in attached and small lot housing, the demand is much higher than the supply, but in the conventional lot, which is the suburban cookie cutter subdivision model, the supply far exceeds the demand. In addition, it's not available at the affordable prices. So here we have on the top bar the extremely low income, where only 35 out of 100 find housing supply with what is available today, and only 55% find supply when they are at 50% of AMI. At 80% it gets better, but it's still not everybody, it's only 93, and only when we are at above or at the mean income, then we have an oversupply. And if one parses this out further, you can see that there are a lot of more units of expensive housing than there are people that can afford that. So we have this mismatch, this gap. Our usual assumption is that the urban crisis was created by losing jobs and shifting industry, but there is a lot more that changed. The new gig economy, or however we want to call it, leaves a large amount of people that are too poor to live inside the HUD-defined 30% housing cost limit. As a result, we have a growing demand and a supply mismatch, housing at the wrong price in the wrong place and of the wrong kind, because people just don't earn enough money, which is of course going outside of my competence, but it is really part of the equation. Not to forget that the wrong place also means that too much housing is still built in the suburbs where it rarely is affordable, nor does it cater to the new lifestyles. The online website Strong Cities called the suburban outward growth model in a series that they did in 2011 of income stratified monocultures on greenfields a Ponzi scheme, because it builds on an ever expanding model of paying the older parts with the money that flows in with of the newer parts, and the newer parts are giving net income because they are new and don't need the maintenance. But the further you extend this out, the less this is a sustainable way of growing. So reshaping the city, when we think about housing, we need to shift this ongoing mismatch through smart growth. So we can't rebuild our cities if we let the growth happen in the greenfields unabated. So in short, we have a truly affordable housing crisis in terms of real estate prices and seemingly large expanses of public housing. And in spite of these large expanses of public housing that we see in Rochester or in Baltimore, the affordable housing crisis also exists in Baltimore and Rochester. And not only that, it exists in spite of a fairly large amount of abandoned and vacant housing. So one would say, well, how is this possible? How can you have an oversupply of housing that manifests itself in abandoned housing and at the same time an undersupply of affordable housing? Well, there are two answers to that, or two simple answers: markets and money. And I want to go through this a little bit. The markets. So both Baltimore and Rochester created these maps that show what the housing markets are like, and the dark colors are usually not the good ones. That means we have these market as stable, transitional high, transitional low, depreciated, distressed, and distressed is the dark stuff. So these maps are the reality. I mean, you can determine that this is the situation. There is no market for a lot of the housing that we have. The question is, what do you do with that information? And when you are going and use these maps to decide that your investments are not made where there is no market, then you are actually completely continuing the redlining of the past. And when you look at these, they look just like the red line maps that we had in the 30s and 40s. And that is a problem. And it is exactly what is happening. So in Baltimore City, and any city that works with building from strengths and investing in mid-markets, you are investing not in the no-market areas. And so in Baltimore, we started to analyze the data for the capital improvement program of the city and looked at where has the CIP money been spent that Baltimore had available. And we found that less than 50% of African American communities, or those that had less than 50% of African Americans in them, received 4 times as much investment as those that were over 85% African American. Or in terms of poverty, low poverty neighborhoods received 1.5 times the investment of high poverty neighborhoods. So we are continuing the redlining. There are reasons for this, of course. When you look where Baltimore has all its vacant houses, and your number of vacant houses, of course, a lot smaller because you're a smaller city too, and you may not quite have as many, but we have 24,000 that are in public property. And of those 24,000, 73% are in the area of no market. And this is one of the projects where we fixed it up actually at the end. They don't always look that bad. That's when you pry open the door of a row house that looks in the front just boarded up but reasonably decent, and inside all the floors had already fallen into each other. So to fix vacancies in an area without market costs more money than fixing vacancies in areas with the market, and money that no bank will loan because it can't be recovered by sales prices. And even if one neglects these extreme forms of abandonment and decay like these pictures show, it is amazing once a building is boarded up how quickly it requires a full gut rehabilitation. And as a result of full gut rehabilitation is really the normal condition for rehab. And in Baltimore, the cost for that is somewhere between $90,000 and $220,000, depending on how big these row houses are. And they could be even higher. And so that's just to do some math here. So if we had 12,000 units in the no market areas, that would cost, when we assume $150,000 as some average cost, $1.66 billion to fix them all up. And just for construction, and another $1.1 billion for site acquisition and preparation and soft cost. So if we were to assume that we could sell 12,000, if we just sell them cheap enough, even in a no market area, that is maybe a conundrum. But if we assume that that demand is really large enough, and we would get maybe $90,000 for these $200,000+ homes, as far as construction cost goes, that would leave us a $1.66 billion shortfall to rehab them all. And that is more than the entire capital budget that the city of Baltimore had in 2018, which was $1.1 billion. So you can see that this type of approach is not the solution. And the older members of the audience may remember Supertramp. And I always found this a quite interesting cover. So the insular approach, where you just do an island in a desert of disinvestment and bad conditions, doesn't work. It cannot be solved on a house-by-house basis, and it can't be solved on a market basis. Instead, we need a bigger view and a different concept of cost and benefit. And so far, we have discussed the cost sort of like a developer in a pro forma. But we all know that the cost of abandonment goes far further than just the cost of fixing up a house. When we talk about the cost of reshaping Rochester, we need to also look at the cost of not reshaping Rochester. Because external to the individual developer pro forma are all the communal societal costs, such as the cost of the community in the form of lost tax base, the cost of the community in the form of policing, increased crime and lack of safety, the cost to entire segments of the population in the form of lost ability to accrue wealth from real estate, the cost to entire segments of the population in the form of lost opportunities through the lack of services, lack of education, lack of access, and lack of jobs that comes with being in a community that is underserved, and the health cost from poor living conditions. So the community condition and health are closely related. The graph prepared here by the Baltimore Neighborhoods Indicators Alliance, which is associated with the University of Baltimore, that kind of do a lot of data crunching, because we talked today a lot about evidence-based policies, so we want to not just speculate, we want to know what's really happening. And sometimes these things seem to be self-evident, but they did graph here where the life expectancy is the highest, which is the y-axis, and then where the number of vacant houses is the highest, and that's the x-axis. And you can see where there's no abandonment, the life expectancy is the highest. Not totally unexpected, and one can discuss a long time what's chicken and egg in this, which is what you like to do a lot when you see correlation. It may not always be causation. But anyway, it's clear that health outcomes are determined by housing on the building level and on the community level. Or as the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation says, our homes and our communities have enormous impacts on our health. And one can play this through. I'm not telling you anything new, but we had health and safety and life safety is one of the continued credits, so I have to expand a bit on this. On the building level, when you have poor living conditions and unimproved homes, you have poor temperature control, you have mold, you have air quality issues. This can be because of poorly designed HVAC systems, but it can also be because the building envelope is uninsulated and the roof is leaky and the windows are leaking, the doors. Other factors include rodents, building materials, which may emit fumes. You may have steep stairs in old buildings, rickety railings, people fall a lot, lead paint issues, lead in the water pipes, asbestos in the plaster, in the insulation, radon pollution. So the list of what can happen in a building to give you a poor health outcomes is almost endless. And the correlation between poverty and bad housing is direct. And on the community levels, the health indicators are even more numerous. So security and crime, and I mentioned these things, but they go down to levels of like lack of green canopy, tree canopy, poor sidewalks, streets that are unsafe, no crosswalks, no signals. You get run over more often when the kids play outside. I mean, these pathologies and the poor results of poor investment from all departments in our cities, they go down all the way. When you look at the green tree canopy, we found, at least in Baltimore where we did that the tree canopy was a lot lower in the disinvested communities than in the better communities. And as a result, the heat island effect is worse, so in the summer the heat is a lot worse, and so on. So it goes on, which means goes back to the question of where do we put actually our money. For any solution to the divided city problem, we need to look at the big picture, the national scale, the regional scale, the city scale, the community scale. And the solutions need to be found on all of those scales as well. So we talked already a little bit about smart growth, which is, the regional scale. But from a strictly economic point of view, the repair that we can't afford, as I pointed out, on the traditional way, has to eventually pay for itself. And so what we need is an initial kickstart. And what is needed is a virtuous feedback loop, a strategy that requires this initial catalytic event and then runs on its own. That sounds simple, and the magic is to kick it off, to kick that feedback loop, that virtuous cycle off at the right time, in the right place, and with the kick of the right scale. And for this to work, it needs consensus and a plan. These are all sort of self-evident truths, but it's amazing how often they are forgotten. In order to use scarce funds wisely, a step-ladder investment strategy has to be devised that starts out with flat-out subsidy, but aims for gradual reduction in subsidy. The kickstart should be built from the same strengths and asset, from some strengths and asset one can find. That doesn't mean you just invest in the mid-level communities that are already doing pretty well. It means that even in disinvested communities, you find an element of strengths, and we can find that everywhere. And often it is the historic character of the community or the vestiges of the historic character that are still left. And most importantly, maybe the plan needs to be a win-win and not a win-lose proposition. And it needs to be developed by many people and from the ground up. And even if you do all that, and you are now having all your elements together to have the right kickstart, and you're thinking about your virtuous loop based on what you know, so far, then there are still disruptors. The future will not be like what it used to be, if Yogi Berra free interpretation. It's not what it's going to be used to be. And so what are the elements of disruption that we have to prepare for, and which ones of those may actually help us? So demographics. Households keep shrinking. So that means there are fewer people that need, in the past, more and more space. So that means fewer people can occupy all the houses. So Baltimore, for example, lost about 35% of the population, but only 10% of the households are needed to fill these 33% houses that are vacant back up. So there's a difference between population loss and household loss because households are much smaller. And the strategy is to target particularly those young and small and child-free households or the retirees to grow the city back because they cost less, that you don't have to fix all the schools to attract those two particular demographics. In the United States today, we have more households that are child-free than households that have children. And we often forget that when we start agonizing, about our schools. It is not all about schools any longer, although it is important. I have six children. Increasing diversity. This is something we talk about every day because there are some people that don't like that. But the fact is we have it, and we can target it as a strategy for our city, that we are actually inviting and attracting the immigrants and provide them with access to opportunity and adult education. That is a growth strategy. Urbanization. Urbanization happens on a global scale. In the last few years, we have now more people living in urbanized areas globally than outside, in spite of suburbs and sprawl that I talked about. So the strategy is to target those folks that live in expensive places like San Francisco, Denver, Austin, New York, or Nashville, in places where they can't afford it anymore, and they are looking for the next opportunity cities to come to. We should target those folks. We should think about robots, and everybody is agonizing of the artificial intelligence and robots taking our jobs. And I mentioned already the gig economy. But when we try to turn this into a strategy, we need to create live-work spaces for those that actually grow food in the urban setting, or they have 3D printers at home, Peregrine, and make stuff at home. We have a new economy coming where just like you can print everything today on your computer at home, you can also print products at home. And we don't know exactly yet how this goes out. A lot of people are very skeptical how this goes with 3D printing. But the manufacturing that we see out here isn't necessarily the manufacturing that will be the prevailing manufacturing of the future. It will coexist. But, we need live workspaces where we can use the leverage large abandoned urban structures that we have plenty of. And of course we need to raise the wages also. And just to repeat this again, the suburbs really do not cater to these new trends particularly. They don't cater to the philosophy that cherishes experience over consumption, or that cherishes a mix of uses and diversity and amenities, culture. And in fact, the suburbs may be the slums of tomorrow if they do not manage to become more diverse and more urban. So the shrinking cities have to assertively channel these new demands into their jurisdiction and convince state and local legislators in the surrounding counties that the region as such won't succeed without a healthy core city. And value creation through planning for virtuous cycles increases the local tax base. And this isn't a zero-sum game in spite of, my little jibes against the suburbs. If done right, it is not a deadly competition between the city and the suburb, but a healthy synergy between the two, a win-win situation that makes it better for both. And those kind of bigger thinking approaches to it that think beyond the individual house and that do even think beyond the city as the jurisdiction. These broad strategies require to work across traditional responsibilities. So under President Obama, on the federal level, they created this interdepartmental sustainable community initiative, which I found very exciting at the time. HUD, DOT, and EPA, they worked together across their silos, and Obama apparently, as one member of DOT told me, really took personal interest in that to make sure that these folks talk together with the outcome in mind that they want a sustainable community. And a sustainable communities has to have an economic, an environmental, a social element in it. The mayor of Baltimore, Catherine Pugh, when she was elected last year, she did her first cabinet meeting by loading everybody in a bus. And then she drove everybody to Sandtown, Winchester, which is, now famous across the world as the home of Freddie Gray and one of the most protected urban ghettos, if you will, that we have in the United States. And she unloaded them all in West Baltimore, and then she went from one to the other and said, what can your department offer to change these conditions? Now that was a very promising start. These folks are still working across silos, but we have to watch out, then very soon they'll go back to business as usual. Back to money. To fund community redevelopment, the entire community needs to pull together. The mayor, the council, the business community, the banks, the healthcare and insurance industry, the institutions, the nonprofits, and of course the community leaders. And those funds can take many, many forms. They are the non-conventional funding mechanisms. The money isn't coming from HUD anymore. It's not coming out of Washington anymore. It comes in small dribbles, but not like the community block grants of the past. So there are still affordable housing tax credit programs, of course, and grants but funded by the state, home funds, and so on, that are the most common current source for affordable housing. But we need to think about other ways to tap into money. There is lots of money sloshing around the globe because of this huge income disparity that we have. So there are lots of people that are actually asking themselves, where do I invest? And they are starting to look outside those cities that I mentioned before where this has gotten super expensive to invest. And they're looking for opportunity cities, and they come to Baltimore and they come to Rochester. But they do not come to an individual piece of property and would invest in an area of no market. But when you have a plan, like the Central Baltimore Partnership had one, where a lot of stakeholders come together and agree on a strategy forward, and you have a reinvestment fund, which was actually a private fund, that pools investor money in a pot and guarantees a return, because they are so confident that a ground-based, community-based, multi-stakeholder plan will work out at the end and be this virtuous cycle in which, at the end, you don't need the full-on subsidies anymore, but where at the end the cost of a renovation can be recaptured through sales. Then you get the people to invest. And they got, in this case, about 300 private investors to pool money in this reinvestment fund, and the community inside the Central Baltimore Partnership that has Johns Hopkins and others in there is Barclay, and Barclay is now at the point where the row houses sell for more than it costs to fix them up. So the people start to get a return in investment. Now, public investments need to correspond with that. And I talked about earlier when we said Baltimore invested all their money in the areas, that wouldn't need it as much, which is called the middle market investment. Baltimore hired an equity director under the Department of Planning, and she analyzed the budgets from 2014 to 2019. And I told you earlier about the discrepancies, which you see here in a different way. Again, the bottom bar, the dark bar, is the African American investment, or the areas in investments in African American communities. And you can see that bottom bar in 2016-17 was really, really low when you consider that we have a majority black city. And in 2019, in the new budget, they made a difference. They bumped this way up. Now, what are the investments that they do? Two examples, and there is a lot more, of course, but we don't have time to go through everything. The planning department just published last week the sustainability plan. This is supposed to be showing up properly. This is the title page of the Baltimore Sustainability Plan. And this is the second generation of a sustainability plan. The first generation was very much on green housing and on climate change and the big sustainability issues. This version has a very strong equity lens in it, because they said no city can be sustainable economically in any way if we are leaving so many people completely out. So this sustainability plan has a lot of sustainability elements in there that work on the equity basis, and then housing affordability is one component to it. Another thing that the Baltimore City Planning Department just did very recently is the Green Network Plan. And the Green Network Plan is based on this housing demolition that I talked about earlier. The vacants. It's very easy to tear them down. That costs money, but no city has ever demolished its way out of no growth or shrinking or economic recession. So, however, you can get either a lot of scattered green sites where the demolition happened, or you can do it strategically. And the big goal of this Green Network Plan is to do it strategically so that the green lots that you get, where you do demolition, add up to a network, that they are connected, that there are pathways in it, greenways in it, and that they connect you to parks, and that they become an asset, so that when they are systematically done as a system of green spaces, they actually add value to the community. And they are a piece of this making the market eventually work. Finally, about design. This is, after all, the Community Design Center. And I'm an architect, so what are we doing? We're supposed to be designers, right? Everybody can tell the difference between good and bad design, although the opinions differ, but when it's bad design, it's like with pornography, you can tell right away. And everybody can tell the difference between a desirable and a non-desirable community. And it is amazing how much bad design our profession, urban planners, everybody that was supposed to be so smart, did in terms of public housing and affordable housing. So, these are Baltimore pictures, and bottom right is here, and I didn't want to step on anybody's toes, but this affordable housing in your city looks a little different than ours, but it's just immediately recognizable as such. And that's not a good condition. We demolished all of our high rises. I don't actually agree with that. That was a very sort of like, okay, it's the building, that's the building's fault. So we blow it up. But we could have repurposed these for elderly singles, and that would have worked. That didn't work for families. So anyway, design is important. And sometimes it just means we keep historic buildings and we take care of them and we rehab them and we repurpose them and we take care of our open spaces, And I have a project that our firm did, and then the bottom here is the Holy Rosary housing, where a convent and church is repurposed in your community, or the Cunningham Carriage House on the right. So the National Park Service did a study between 5 cities in America, and Baltimore was one, and they found across all these cities that the historic districts, the areas where the whole historic fabric was protected, that they performed best in economic development as well. So taking care of the old stuff really matters. But sometimes we need to design something that didn't exist quite like that before, at least not in affordable housing. And a lot of recent projects in affordable housing here in Rochester and back in Baltimore have shown that affordable housing doesn't have to stick out like a sore thumb, and that it can be as good as market rate, even if it isn't mixed necessarily directly in the project itself, mixed in income or mixed in use, but it can look like it belongs, and it can look like just like market rate housing. And obviously you have a very good example here that is affordable and market rate and commercial a little bit and everything in one project, and that's the Charlotte Square on the Loop. And here households can earn a wide range of incomes from 40 to 90% of median income, and there are even 8 units set aside for prison outreach and on-site counseling and supportive housing for homeless ex-offenders who are graduating from transitional housing. So this is super courageous to do this, to put market rate and those service homes together. But that is the way to do it. You're not isolating everything into different segments of the city, but you put it together, and then nobody will know. And it will not matter, because these things work synergistically together. And you can enact this through regulations. You can have enlightened developers that do this, but you can also mandate in your zoning ordinance that every larger development has to have an affordable component. And so then you get also affordable housing that is protecting the renters from displacement, not only in the poor communities through investment there, but you get them also in every market rate development, because if you have a set aside for affordable, then it comes with the development. So interconnected community development of that, that puts right housing affordable in the right place, that won't happen without resistance. If you guys debate urban development in any way like we do in Baltimore, it is obvious to you that if you were to apply all the principles and tools I presented, and you think even of the disruptions, you would get still pushback, and the effort would be labeled as, what would be the label that would be stuck on your improvements?
Socialism.
Yeah, well, that's right, that's also one, but the more common one, gentrification. That's a conversation killer, right? People say gentrification, and boom, what are you going to say? It is, when you look it up in the dictionary, there are a number of definitions, but the process of renovating and improving a district so that it conforms to middle-class taste. I think that's a pretty good definition. That is not the right thing to do, obviously. But then what people most often mean is actually displacement. And so the fears need to be countered with building trust. And trust can only come from an equitable approach, from a win-win and a bottom-up planning. Building trust needs not only positive feedback loops, but it needs also small policy changes, such as poor rental housing from small slumlords through a strict licensing regime. I understand you have that in place here, which reduces the health risk from code violations. So it's not only public housing and the big operations that have hundreds of units, it's also the small landlords, and oftentimes the small landlords that have that to secure their retirement or whatever, they have 1 or 2 rental units, and the people that live in those units, they are both equally challenged and stuck in vicious cycles. And so the help, the policy help, the assistance, the guidance needs to come for both of those. Or better balance in the rent court. I mean, there are not too many of you have been in rent court maybe, but when you go to rent court, you will see that this is a very uneven outcome most of the time in favor of the landlords, and that the folks that are the renters are not able to really hold their own there. Or that houses, when going to homeowners, lose their homes because of foreclosure over water bill. It's a very big deal in Baltimore because we have raised our water bills so much in order to pay all this falling apart infrastructure. Or foreclosures from predatory lending, which we all know. And overall, beyond this policy change is also a more inclusive and transparent planning approach. And then also it is something simple as a homestead credit. In Baltimore City and County, we have homestead credits that when you are actually living in your own unit, then and you're doing an improvement, you can write the improvement off and it doesn't go immediately into your increased assessment. Or when the assessment increases because of market change, then this is capped to 4% increase per assessment period and not more. So even if the market goes up 15%, you'll never be hit with that at once. So those kinds of things are also important. Finally, for the region in the post-industrial knowledge economy to prosper, it must be diverse in use, income, and race across all areas. This means more affordable housing in the suburbs, in the well-to-do city areas, and in the formerly disinvested areas, as well as market rate housing in the former no-market areas. The revival of abandoned and disinvested no-market areas is not only a moral obligation, but it would sometimes also make us make use of the most walkable and desirable parts of cities with the most history and frequently also the most interesting architecture if we would just put the investment in there. Inclusion does not come by default, and it does not come from the market. And it is often not welcome in the prosperous parts of the town and not welcome in the disenfranchised parts of town. The inclusive city does not simply come from moving with business as usual. It requires targeted interventions at every step of the way. It needs to avoid income stratified communities as we know them from past development patterns. Not stratified on the upper level and not stratified on the lower scale. It needs to invest in disinvested areas and move communities out of poverty. We shouldn't talk about poverty as if this was a constant, like a universal constant that we can't change. A 30% poverty rate, a 20% poverty is just abysmal. So we need to have the courage to think that we can actually lift people in communities out of poverty too through the right investment. And we need to avoid displacement, obviously. And the best way to avoid displacement is to have income restrictive, long-term income restrictive affordable housing. But there are other ways, like community land trusts and co-ops and so on and so forth. We need a wide range of partners. We all need to work together and find creative funding, as I described earlier. We need to prioritize rehabilitation over demolition. We need to break agencies out of their silos. All that is easier said than done, but it must be done, and we all need to roll up our sleeves even if it's cold outside. Thank you.